The fire hit just after dawn. I was in the greenhouse transplanting bell peppers when the wind shifted, and I caught the smell acrid, smoky, wrong. I bolted outside, heart pounding, and saw the entire western edge of my property lit up in flames. My cornfield, 3 acres of it, was crackling and spitting fire like it was alive and angry. I grabbed the hose, screamed for my neighbor, and called 911 with shaking fingers all at once. But by the time the fire trucks got there, the damage was done. Everything on that side of the property, corn, fencing, irrigation lines, was torched. Useless. Gone. They ruled it arson. That same afternoon, I found a letter duct taped to my mailbox. No envelope, just a printed notice. Notice of violation. Excessive agricultural use. Immediate fines imposed. Cleared area in accordance with HOA guidelines. President Alberta Renshaw, Maple Hollow HOA. I swear to God, I almost passed out. Now let me back up. My name's Jude Jensen. I'm a widower, mid-40s, ex-forestry officer, and I moved to Maple Hollow 2 years ago after my wife passed. It's a semi-rural neighborhood outside of Asheville with big lots, wooded trails, and a board full of people who think they're royalty because they sit in folding chairs once a month and vote on mailbox colors. I own 5 acres of land on the edge of the community. I bought it before the HOA even existed. They formed 6 months after I moved in, mostly thanks to Alberta Renshaw, a retired consultant who never minds her own damn business. She's in her 60s, wears pastel cardigans like armor, and talks with her hands like she's conducting a courtroom. She also treats the HOA charter like it's federal law. They'd been hassling me for months. First, it was the color of my shed. Then, the height of my grass. Then they said my farm plots made the neighborhood aesthetic suffer. I told them to kick rocks. I had zoning permits that predated their little HOA club. But that didn't stop Alberta and her group of clipboard warriors from walking the perimeter of my land every week, taking photos and whispering like I'd planted uranium instead of tomatoes. But I never thought they'd go this far. The sheriff's deputy who came out said they'd be looking into it. I asked if they'd talk to Alberta. He looked uncomfortable. "We'll talk to everyone," he said. That was a week ago. Still nothing. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I installed cameras. Everywhere. Hidden trail cams. Motion-activated recorders. One inside a fake birdhouse. Another in a busted lawnmower out by the property line. I wanted to catch them in the act of something. Anything. 3 days later, I got what I needed and then some. It was about 2 in the morning. Alberta, and 2 of her little board members, Clive, the balding insurance adjuster, and Melody, who sells essential oils and thinks she's a wellness ambassador, walked onto my property with gas cans. I watched the footage in my living room. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I'd crack a molar. Alberta was the one who lit it, clear as day. She struck the match, tossed it onto the dry stalks, and said, "Let's see how he likes this violation." I didn't call the cops. Not yet. No, I needed to make sure they paid for this the right way. The next morning, I drove straight to the county clerk's office and pulled every zoning map, land record, and tax document I could find. Maple Hollow HOA didn't actually own the roads, the parks, or even the community clubhouse. All of it sat on a 6-acre parcel still technically owned by the original developer, a bankrupt firm that had gone belly up and disappeared. The county had been trying to auction it off for unpaid taxes for over a year. You know what that means? It was for sale. So I bought it. All 6 acres. The roads. The clubhouse. The tiny dog park Alberta loved to walk her Shih Tzu through every morning at precisely 7:15 while judging everyone's lawn. I paid cash. The sale went through in 48 hours. Then I posted a sign on the clubhouse door. Private property. All HOA board members banned. No trespassing. Alberta showed up 20 minutes later, red-faced and storming up my driveway like she was going to call in an airstrike. I was already waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee and my lawyer on speakerphone. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, jabbing a finger at me like it was a bayonet. "Actually," I said, "I own the land now. You and your HOA board are barred from using it. As for the arson, well, I've got footage." Her face went pale, like she'd swallowed bleach. "You're bluffing." I held up my phone, tapped play, and let the video speak for itself. The gas cans. The match. Her voice. She staggered back like I'd slapped her. "I'll sue you," she sputtered. "Nope," I said, "because I'm pressing charges first. And I've already sent this to the sheriff. You might want to get a lawyer." A real one. Later that day, the sheriff's department finally showed up, this time with arrest warrants. Alberta, Clive, and Melody were all taken in for questioning. The charges: arson, trespassing, destruction of property, and conspiracy. I didn't even have to lift a finger. Just handed over the footage and watched them get cuffed from my porch. But I wasn't done yet, because now that I owned the land the HOA operated on, I had plans. Big ones. Alberta's arrest didn't just shake the neighborhood, it rattled it to the foundation. Word spread faster than gossip at a church potluck. By sunset, half the community had seen the footage, and the rest had heard whispers of it from their neighbors, mail carriers, or the cashier at the local feed store. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Owning the land the HOA operated on was just the beginning. I didn't buy those 6 acres for revenge, I bought them to dismantle the rotten scaffolding Alberta and her little cabal had built around this place. They'd turned a peaceful community into a petty dictatorship, and if I was going to fix things, I had to be methodical. The day after the arrests, I drove out to the parcel's edge, an overgrown stretch of brush behind the clubhouse. I brought a folding chair, a clipboard, and a thermos of black coffee, and I sat there for hours watching. Folks slowed their cars when they passed. A few stopped to talk. First was a wiry old man with a walking stick and a voice like sandpaper. "You're the one who bought the HOA land, ain't you?" he asked. "That's right. Name's Jude." He nodded. "Name's Russell. Used to be on the town planning commission. Before Alberta ran me off." "What happened?" "She threatened to fine me for having unauthorized fencing. Wasn't even on my property. Just a survey marker sticking out of the ground. She didn't like that I told her she was wrong. I offered him the spare chair." He sat slowly, like someone who hadn't had a real conversation in years. Over the next few hours, more people came by. A young couple on bikes. A woman walking twin beagles. A teenager pushing a lawnmower who paused long enough to ask if it was true Alberta was in jail. I didn't have to say much. People had things they needed to get off their chests. Stories. Documents. Photos. One woman brought a folder stuffed with copies of every warning letter Alberta had ever sent her, 37 in total. By sundown, I had 2 full legal pads of handwritten notes and contact info from over 24 residents who'd been bullied, fined, or otherwise harassed by the HOA board. That night, I started assembling them into categories. I wasn't just going after the board, I was going after the HOA's legitimacy itself. I needed to prove it had never been properly ratified. I started by tracking down the original bylaws. They were supposed to be filed with the county when the HOA formed. After searching through public records and digging into archived meeting minutes, I found something strange. The signature on the founding document wasn't Alberta's. It was someone named Geraldine Vance. But that name had never appeared on any public notices, board rosters, or community announcements. I flagged it and kept digging. 3 days later, I found Geraldine. She worked at a bookstore in town. 68 years old, sharp as a dagger, and absolutely livid when I showed her a copy of the signature. "I never signed this," she said, slamming the page on the counter. Alberta asked me to help her draft up a sample form when she was thinking of starting the HOA. I gave her a mock-up. "This is that form." She forged my name and filed it. I asked if she'd be willing to testify. She didn't hesitate. Back at home, I converted my garage into a temporary war room. Charts on the walls. Binders of evidence. A whiteboard tracking HOA violations by date, name, and dollar amount. I wasn't just building a case, I was constructing a demolition plan. 2 days later, I got a letter from an attorney. Not one of Alberta's, this one came from the interim HOA vice president, a man named Theodore Blanche. He was demanding access to the now private land for essential community functions, including emergency access to the clubhouse and weekly board meetings. I wrote a response with the help of my own attorney, citing my ownership, the trespassing laws, and the fact that the HOA had never secured legal easements. Then I added a clause: if any board member set foot on the property without explicit permission, I'd file civil trespass charges. Theodore didn't reply. Instead, the board tried a new tactic. They sent out a mass mailer to every resident in Maple Hollow, a glossy, full-color newsletter claiming that I was endangering the community, threatening the safety of children, and creating legal chaos. They even claimed I was planning to bulldoze the park and replace it with a pig farm. That was the last straw. I called a meeting. Not an HOA meeting, a neighborhood gathering. I rented the VFW hall in town and put up flyers at the local diner, hardware store, and grocery. No fancy fonts. Just black and white paper that said, "Let's talk about Maple Hollow." Thursday, 7 p.m. open to all residents. I brought donuts, coffee, and a stack of folders for every attendee, each one containing copies of the forged signature, a map of the land I now owned, and a breakdown of the HOA's financials that I'd obtained through a public records request. Over 50 people showed up. I didn't give a speech. I handed out the folders, waited until everyone had looked through them, and then I said one sentence. "You've all been lied to." For the next hour, we worked through it all. People spoke, some for the first time in years. A retired schoolteacher revealed that she'd been fined over $2,000 for planting native flowers instead of approved ornamentals. A single mother told us how she was threatened with foreclosure over a late fee she never knew existed. A teenage boy explained how Clive once reported him for loitering while he waited for the school bus. By the end of the meeting, there were tears, anger, but also something else: resolve. We took a vote. Unanimously, the residents asked me to help them dissolve the HOA. It wouldn't be easy. It required a supermajority of property owners, 75%, and a formal petition to the county registrar. But with the evidence I had and the momentum we'd built, it wasn't impossible. The next morning, I started drafting the petition. I knocked on every door, explained calmly, showed the documents, collected signatures. Some folks had doubts, but most were eager to sign once they understood just how deep the corruption ran. By the end of the week, I had 79% of property owners on board. I submitted the petition with all necessary documentation. The county scheduled a hearing 2 weeks out. That same day, Alberta was released on bail. She returned home under house arrest, ankle monitor and all. But that didn't stop her from trying to stir the pot. She sent out a furious letter to the neighborhood claiming she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign and accusing me of sabotaging years of community progress. She begged residents not to fall for the lies of a man with no respect for order. I didn't bother replying. Instead, I prepared for the hearing. The day came. County courthouse. Packed room. Alberta showed up, flanked by 2 attorneys and wearing a neck brace that hadn't been there 2 days earlier when she was spotted yelling at a delivery driver from her porch. I brought Geraldine to testify. I brought Russell. I brought copies of the forged documents, videos, letters, and financial records showing tens of thousands of dollars in administrative fees that had vanished into a private account under Clive's name. The judge needed less than 30 minutes. The Maple Hollow HOA was officially dissolved. Alberta's expression didn't change. She sat there, mouth tight, eyes wide, like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. I didn't look at her. I was too busy shaking hands with neighbors who, for the first time in years, felt like they had their homes back. But I wasn't finished yet. Because with the HOA disbanded, its coffers frozen, and its board under investigation, there was still the matter of restitution. And I had a plan for that, too. The dissolution of the Maple Hollow HOA didn't bring silence. It brought questions. 100 little what-nows from people who hadn't known what it meant to live without someone breathing down their neck about the color of their mailbox or the shape of their garden hose. For the first time in years, folks were free, but freedom, oddly enough, made some of them nervous. That's where the restitution plan came in. I wasn't aiming for revenge. I wanted restoration of property, of dignity, and of trust. Alberta's board had collected tens of thousands in bogus fines, some of which I'd traced to luxury items purchased under the HOA's maintenance budget. A massage chair, catering bills from a private chef in Charlotte, even a weekend retreat at a vineyard, listed as a policy seminar. I got the green light from the county to request an audit of the HOA's financial history. The county's Civil Enforcement Division brought in a forensic accountant named Darnell Price. He was a quiet man, barrel-chested and soft-spoken, with a habit of tapping his pen twice before saying anything. We sat in my converted garage-turned-office while he flipped through folders and receipts with surgical precision. Most of these expenses were never authorized through a formal vote, he said one afternoon, adjusting his glasses without looking up. That alone is enough to trigger a clawback. How far back can we go? 7 years. Maybe more if we prove fraud. He tapped the invoice for the vineyard retreat. This one's interesting, he said. The payment came from the HOA account, but the deposit was made into a personal joint account shared by Clive and someone named Maxwell Franks. Maxwell? I leaned in. That's Alberta's nephew. Darnell nodded. Then we're looking at embezzlement. I brought the findings to the residents in waves, never all at once. I met them in driveways, on porches, at the feed store or the community center. I showed them the receipts, then offered to help them file individual claims through small claims court. I gave them templates and walked them through the process step by step. Within 10 days, 31 separate lawsuits had been filed against the former HOA board members. Alberta's attorney filed a motion to dismiss them all, citing frivolous intentions. The judge denied the motion without comment. The lawsuits were only part of it. The land I'd bought, the 6 acres on which their little empire had stood, wasn't going to sit idle. I had something else in mind for it. Something that would serve the people who'd been walked on, fined, and silenced for years. I broke ground on the community garden first. I didn't ask for permits. Didn't need to. The land was mine outright, and the zoning allowed for non-commercial agriculture. I rented a backhoe, laid out the beds, and started turning soil with help from a few volunteers. Beth, the woman with the twin beagles, brought over crates of seedlings. Her son helped me spread mulch. We built it bed by bed, row by row. No one was told what they could or couldn't plant. No one got a letter about aesthetic harmony. No one was fined for using recycled planters or painting their sign by hand. Next came the workshop space. An old prefab structure sat near the edge of the parcel originally used as the HOA's administrative annex. I gutted it. We insulated it, rewired it, and turned it into a shared workspace for hobbies and repairs. Retired electrician named Warren volunteered to teach classes on wiring and safety. A high school girl named Dakota started hosting weekend woodworking sessions for kids. One afternoon, I was repairing the workshop's door hinge when a man I hadn't seen before approached. He was tall, lean, with scruffy gray stubble and a faded Army Ranger's hat. He introduced himself as Elias and said he'd just moved into the east end of the neighborhood. Didn't think anyone around here gave a damn about community anymore, he said, watching me tighten bolts. Then I saw the garden. You served. 3 tours. Got out, drove trucks for a while. Figured I'd settle somewhere quiet. Didn't know I was moving into a war zone. Not anymore, I told him. We're building something different. He nodded once, then knelt to help without another word. By sundown, we'd fixed not just the hinge but the entire door frame. Word got around fast. Donations started showing up. Old tools, buckets of paint, a used bandsaw from a guy 2 neighborhoods over. A retired librarian dropped off shelves and boxes of books for a free community library. No one asked for permission. No one needed to. But not everyone was ready to let go of the old regime. One morning, I got a call from Beth. She said a man in a suit had been walking door to door asking residents to sign a petition. When she asked what it was for, he claimed it was to restore order and re-establish community governance. He didn't mention Alberta's name, but he didn't have to. I waited for him at the edge of my property. He showed up just before noon, broad-shouldered, slick hair, and a clipboard in hand. He wore a smile like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. "You must be Mr. Jensen," he said. "That's me. I'm here on behalf of a small group of concerned residents. We're hoping to form a new HOA, one with clearer accountability and stronger oversight." "Let me guess," I said. "Backed by Alberta and her friends?" He hesitated, just long enough to confirm it. "We believe the neighborhood needs structure, direction. What it needs is healing. Not another power structure." He adjusted his tie. "Without an association, who enforces standards? Who ensures property values stay high? I'll tell you what I told Alberta. This isn't a country club. It's a neighborhood. People live here. They're not assets. They're human." He tried to hand me the clipboard. I didn't take it. Instead, I pointed to the full garden behind me. The kids hammering nails in the workshop. The old veterans playing checkers under the shade of the old oak. That was all the order we needed. He left without another word. Later that week, I learned he'd only collected 9 signatures. Most of those were from absentee landlords who'd never set foot on the block. The lawsuits against the old board finally started hitting court. Clive lost his first case and was ordered to repay over $4,000 in improper fines and fees. Melody's turn came next. She tried to claim she was just following procedure. The judge didn't buy it. Meanwhile, Alberta's criminal trial loomed. Her attorney tried to work out a plea deal, but the DA wasn't budging, not with video evidence and community impact statements stacking up like bricks. I didn't attend the hearings out of spite. I went because I wanted the truth on record. On the stand, Alberta still tried to posture. She claimed she was protecting the neighborhood from blight. When asked about the fire, she said it was a controlled burn gone wrong. A lie so transparent even the stenographer raised an eyebrow. The jury didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 2 years probation, a year of house arrest, and over $30,000 in restitution payments. She would never again be allowed to serve on any governing board within the county. The neighborhood changed after that. Not overnight, but steadily. People started waving to each other again. They brought casseroles to neighbors who were sick. They helped rebuild fences, trim trees, and patch roofs. The garden grew from 20 plots to 50, and we added fruit trees along the northern edge. Elias built a flagpole and raised it by hand. Every morning, he hoisted the stars and stripes without fail. Nobody told him to. He just did it. We celebrated the first HOA-free year with a barbecue on the land they once ruled from. 50 households showed up. Kids ran through sprinklers. Old-timers swapped stories. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought a smoker full of ribs. No one gave out citations. No one whispered about violations. We didn't need a board to tell us how to be neighbors. We just needed the space to remember how. The first frost of the season settled over Maple Hollow with a hush that felt earned. The garden beds were cleared out, the workshop locked for the winter, and the community, once divided by paranoia and petty fines, had found something sturdier than rules to bind it together. Winter didn't just test the land, it tested people too. And this year, for the first time in a long while, folks leaned in instead of pulling away. The former board members faded into the background. Alberta's house sat silent, blinds always drawn. Clive sold his property and moved out to a gated development on the far side of the county. Melody popped up once or twice at town council meetings, but without an audience to impress. She melted into the crowd like warm paint. I figured things were finally settling. Then, I got a call from Darnell. "I just got a notice," he said. "There's a lien on the parcel you bought." I stood in the middle of the workshop, holding a level and a hammer, and stared at the phone like it had spoken a second language. From who? Turns out, the original developer left behind a secondary loan agreement buried in the fine print, a dormant clause tied to a private creditor. It was never triggered because the developer defaulted before the clause activated. But now that it's under new ownership, they're trying to collect? Exactly. And they're not amateurs. The lien was from a holding company out of Atlanta. I dug into it myself and found it was run by a man named Julian Kess, real estate speculator, known for buying distressed properties, then flipping them to private equity firms or slapping lawsuits on municipalities to force buyouts. He'd seen my little victory and thought he could carve something out for himself. I didn't panic. But I did stop sleeping more than 5 hours a night. The lien wouldn't threaten my ownership immediately, but it gave Kess leverage. If he could prove I'd materially altered the property in a way that breached the dormant clause, he might force a sale. Which meant the garden, the workshop, even the paths we'd built could be used against me. I called a meeting. Not at the VFW. Not in a courtroom. This time, we gathered beneath the old oak tree behind the workshop, bundled in jackets and scarves, thermoses clutched in chilled hands. "I've got a lawsuit coming," I told them. "It's not from the old board. It's from someone who's never set foot here, but wants to take it anyway." Beth furrowed her brow. "Why now?" "Because we made something here. And people like him don't like when something good happens without them profiting from it." Russell, who'd been quietly carving initials into a bench, looked up. "What do we need to do?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew where to start. The dormant clause was tied to a covenant agreement buried inside the original development charter. That charter had been drafted under North Carolina's Uniform Real Estate Act, which allowed for certain exemptions if the land was being used for nonprofit community benefit, and if there was demonstrable public interest in its preservation, which meant I needed to prove two things: that we were nonprofit and that we were valuable to the public. The nonprofit part was easy. I filed the paperwork that week, naming the organization Hollow Roots Collective. Elias helped write the mission statement. Beth handled the bylaws. We kept it simple: provide space for sustainable gardening, trade skills education, and community projects. The public interest part? That was the challenge. I started by contacting the local paper. They'd run a short piece after Alberta's conviction, but nothing since. I invited the editor, a woman named Cassie, to walk the property with me. She showed up in boots and a windbreaker, notepad in hand. "So, Jude," she said, glancing around. "Why now? I thought you'd won. Winning's just the start. Now someone with deeper pockets is coming for it. I need people to know what we've built before he tears it down." She followed me around the garden beds, the frost-covered benches, the makeshift library Elias had added a small honor system box to. I didn't pitch her. I just showed her. She asked questions. About the kids who came on Saturdays. About the veterans who used the workshop. About the woman who'd started a small compost exchange program 2 weeks ago. When she left, she didn't say much. 2 days later, the story ran front page. The headline read, "The Land They Tried to Tame, How One Man's Crop Sparked a Community Reborn." Within hours, my inbox filled up. Not just from neighbors. From people across the state. Gardeners. Civic planners. A teacher from Raleigh who wanted to bring her students up to tour the site. A city council member from Boone who offered legal contacts. Then came the letter from the state's Department of Cultural and Natural Resources, an invitation to submit Hollow Roots for designation as a local cultural landmark. It wouldn't prevent lawsuits, but it would trigger a new layer of review and slow things down. Kes didn't like that. His lawyers filed an injunction claiming I was using media manipulation and frivolous designations to interfere with rightful claims. But the judge ruled the designation process could proceed. That's when Kes made it personal. I came home one evening and found my greenhouse door open. The lock had been snapped. Inside, the irrigation system had been slashed and several of the garden beds overturned. No camera caught it. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. I called the sheriff, filed the report, but I didn't wait for results. I called a welder the next day and had steel bars installed on the greenhouse doors. Then I added floodlights and a new motion sensor system. I didn't tell anyone except Elias, who showed up with a thermos and sat on the porch until sunrise for the next 3 nights, just in case they came back. They didn't. The cultural landmark application went through in early January. The designation didn't just delay Kes's lawsuit, it gave us a platform. We started hosting winter workshops indoors. Seed saving. Tool repair. A candle-making class led by an elderly couple who'd once been fined for excessive porch clutter. Hollow Roots had become more than land. It was a statement. Kes withdrew the lien 2 weeks later. His lawyer sent a letter claiming it was no longer in the company's financial interest to pursue the matter. Translation: the PR was too hot and the legal grounds too shaky. I framed that letter and hung it in the workshop. Winter passed. The first daffodils pushed up through the thawed earth in March. I planted new corn, same plot, same soil, but this time surrounded by a low stone wall hand-laid by volunteers. At dawn, I walked the rows. Not checking for damage. Not looking for violations. Just breathing. Elias joined me halfway through the field. He didn't say anything at first. Just walked beside me, boots crunching in the frost-laced dirt. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't put up that first camera?" he asked. "Every day." He nodded. "Glad you did." We stood there in silence, watching the sun rise over the land they'd once tried to take. Not a single clipboard in sight.